Hi there and welcome back. I'm Terry Burns, and this is the second video of my 24 video series explaining the Hieroglyphic Monad, or Monus Hieroglyphica, of Dr. John Dee of London. This book, in this translation, done by myself and Dr. Nancy Turner over a number of years and published in 2021 by Ouroboros Press. Thank you to them, and thank you to Jeffrey Cooperman for publishing earlier drafts of it. We put in the time understanding the monad, so you don't have to. All you have to do is let us teach you. I would really love feedback and comments down below, but without further ado now, let me go ahead and get started with this second lesson. All right. As I said last time, we're going to look here at the contexts. Some of these will be definitions. For example, what is a monad? What is mercury in Dee's time? And then, since it's a cosmogenic text or a text about the creation of the universe, how is the world created in the three texts that he refers to the most? Plato's Timaeus, Biblical Genesis, and the Sepher Yetzera. And then, of course, we ought to look at what Dee says he's using for context. This is often treated as a work of physical alchemy, but Dee never says it's an alchemical text. He just uses alchemical language. And he explicitly says what kind of text he thinks it is. Okay, without further ado, let's talk about what is a monad. Well, it's the English translation of this word. Haha, that's not helpful, is it? So it comes from a Greek word pronounced almost the same way as this, monas. It's Latinized as monas. Is usually translated into English as unit. In fact, in the first English translation of Euclid done by Billingsley, monas is translated in as unit. The thing is, it's not the same as the number one, so if you're dividing things up geometrically or arithmetically, or if you're making a philosophical point, you usually have somebody instead say monad. Let me explain why. The Pythagoreans use this symbol below to represent the monad, or sometimes they call it the absolute. It's a perfect self-sufficient thing dependent upon nothing but itself. Now, if you have studied the history of the Western mystery tradition, or you're an occultist or an alchemist, you recognize this also as a common symbol for the sun, or for gold, or for Tifereth. And it's the head, so to speak, of this symbol over here. So how does one relate to the other? Well, we're going to get there. But in Pythagorean thought, the monad begets the dyad, like the Vesica piscis. In other words, not two, but it begets the dyad, which begets numbers, which beget a point. So here we also have the point where you would put the needle of the compass to draw a perfect circle. The point, all puns intended, is that it's not the number one, which is the last thing I'm going to say, but also it's a term adopted by Dee and other contemporaries like Giordano Bruno and later philosophers like Leibniz and the Rosicrucians in between. Okay, that was easy. Mercury will not be so easy. This is a philosophic Hermetic text as well as a work of sacred geometry, which means we're going to deal with all kinds of things merged together, often by merging together the meanings of Mercury. The Monus Hieroglyphica is a masterpiece of syncretism. It synthesizes the cosmogony of Plato's Timaeus, Christian Kabbalah, and Genesis, as the three I've already mentioned, but with other things like rediscovered alchemical texts such as the Codex Marcianus. This is one of the very oldest alchemical manuscripts, and Dee had a copy that he copied sometime probably in the 1550s. And when he, a couple decades later, was traveling around with Edward Kelly, and then the two of them break up and Kelly becomes a knight and Dee goes back to England, Dee gifts his copy to the Landgrave of Hesse in Germany. It's a very significant text we could have a whole series of videos about, but we won't, I promise. Also, the idea of a philosopher's king from Plato's Republic and apocalyptic anagogy. We'll define this word later, but briefly, in the late Middle Ages, anagogy is considered like the highest level of scriptural exegesis. I say apocalyptic because Dee is most interested in Genesis and Revelation. Okay, you probably already know that Roman Mercury is roughly equivalent to the Greek Hermes and the Egyptian Thoth, although there are shades of differences between them. Whether you're talking about alchemy or Hermetic thought, Mercury is really, really important and hard to define. So the monad glyph looks like a stylized symbol for Mercury, as many people have pointed out. And it's in a Hermetic kind of cosmogenic egg. It's giving birth to, the monad. So we might ask, what is Mercury to John Dee? That seems like a good question. And I also mentioned in the last video, I was going to come back to this frontispiece. This is a beautiful work of art by Michelle Anderst that we use in our translation. You notice that all of the Latin has been translated, except for this scroll around the outside that says a bunch of words in Latin and then something up here in ancient Greek. If you just directly translate it, it is sort of boring or even, it's opaquely stupid. It's Mercury becomes parent and king of all the planets when perfected by stable, pointed, stillbone. This Greek word phonetically is stillbone. So that makes no sense at all. That's why we left it here. So in our book, we explain it in the introduction, and I am going to do it here now. Dee is presenting this in all capital Greek letters. When he does anything in all caps, it's saying, hey, pay attention. But on the face of it, it seems like he's telling us that Mercury becomes the progenitor and ruler of all the planets when it's perfected by itself. Is it like an Ouroboros serpent, like grabbing its tail? Well, maybe, maybe not. Dee is very into Ouroboros serpents. I mentioned he had merged in some things from the Codex Marcianus. You get this statement with the Ouroboros serpent in the Codex Marcianus that is usually translated as the all is one, not the number one, but the idea that we are all one, that things that look very disparate are actually united. Here's a more stylized version of the Ouroboros serpent from another text. So he could mean that Mercury is becoming like the Ouroboros serpent, I guess. But let's see what Mercury means in alchemy. And in this case, I'm going to defer to one of the greatest living scholars on alchemy, Jennifer Rampling, and this wonderful book that she had come out a couple of years ago, in which chapter 1 asks the question, what is Mercury? And she talks about what is Mercury to different English alchemists in this time period. She also says in her introduction about something that alchemists do that Dee is certainly an expert at. So let me just read you what she says here. Alchemy differs from most fields in the deliberate inaccessibility of language, which requires aspirants to read widely and carefully in order to extract practical sense from the textual record. Why? Because they allude to things widely and carefully. Its philosophically oriented treatises serve as guides to more than chemical operations alone. Like I said in the first video, Dee was not a great physical alchemist. That was Kelly. This is a philosophical Hermetic text. They also then function as manuals of reading practice. Like if you know enough stuff, you'll get the joke. Students of alchemy are frequently warned to be suspicious of literal readings. If someone says to you, the earth is the center of the universe, be careful of taking that too literally. My nose is on my head. Don't take that too literally. They should instead approach their text on multiple levels in a manner reminiscent of medieval techniques of scriptural exegesis, delving into metaphorical and analogical, we ought to throw in there too, anagogical interpretations of even outwardly straightforward terms, such as Mercury. Well, that sounds fun, but to make it more fun, John Dee's Mercury is not totally the Mercury of the English alchemists that came before him, like the Ripley's Compound of Alchemy. He draws on texts that his favorite alchemical grammarian, yes, you read that right, alchemical grammarian, there is a connection, Roger Bacon, did not have available. So what is Mercury to Dee? Now, you think I'm going to just give a straight answer to that? If so, go back to the last slide. Mercury sometimes is a wandering star. That is what we now call a planet. So in the Renaissance, if you looked up at the sky, you would notice that most of the stars didn't move. Or if you measured them, which people did, you'd find out that something like Sirius will move like 1 degree every 72 years. That's the measure of a man, by the way, in I think Shakespeare's Hamlet. It's 72 years, a lifespan why a star moves 1 degree. But the planets are moving all over the place, so they're wandering stars. Mercury is sometimes the powers of the planet Mercury. Sometimes it's a metal. Sometimes it's the philosophic Mercury needed to make the philosopher's stone. Sometimes it's the powers of the god, Hermes Mercury Thoth, who links the upper and lower words. Sometimes it's the power of writing and grammar. Why is that? That's because Mercury is a messenger. But also, Mercury is associated with magic. So is Hermes. So is Thoth. They're analogous versions of the same thing. Mercury is the most androgynous of the gods and goddesses of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. So an androgynous messenger, a shapeshifter, all of those things. So that can be confusing if you want to know, well, which is Mercury now? Well, right now, Mercury may be some of them, all of them. I mean, can a monad be mercuric? Absolutely. Mercury has many attributions, both in terms of Christian or Hermetic Kabbalah and in terms of Agrippan magical correspondences. If you've studied all of those, which I know if you're interested in the monads, chances are you've at least dipped into that. You might think of the Sepher, which is referred to Mercury. You might think of correspondences to magical hours, days, weeks, ages, etc. You might think of zodiacal signs ruled by Mercury, like Gemini. Hi, fellow Geminians, that's me, and so on. Considering all of the above, when you're reading the Monas Hieroglyphia, the challenge becomes which to pick. Is it one of them? Is it all of them, or some subset? All right, that's going to bring us back to this scroll around the egg that I said I would get to. Here we go. The scroll, remember, says Mercury becomes parent and the king of all planets when perfected by stable, pointed stillbone. What the expletive deleted is stillbone, you may be asking. So I'm going to use this as an example to see how Dee thinks. It's really important. It was very important to Dr. Turner and I to try to get into the mind of Dee and like, how does this guy think? He develops things much more through associative thought, allusion, and punning than by any other technique. He refers all over the place. The wordplay in this text is the level of Shakespeare. I'm going to keep at it with references embedded in stillbone as an example. I promise I will not do this every time Dee goes crazy with the punner. I drive you crazy. I'm going to have a separate playlist that is just fun word plays that I want to talk about and can talk about and think they excite me because I'm a retired language and literature professor with no one to talk to about these things that I think are so fun. But if you really are thinking, Terry, could you hurry the expletive deleted up? Yes, I'll put them somewhere else after this one. Dee presents this word in all caps, like I said, all capital Greek letters. When he does that, that means this is important. When he writes in Greek or Hebrew, he means this is important. So we can assume when he does that, he has a reason. I had never found one time when we finished our translation and understood it, there was not one time where he does this accidentally. Sometimes, especially with his Greek, it's because there's a concept or wordplay that doesn't translate well into Latin. And then here we are speaking English. The gall of us. Moving on. Stillbone is a transliteration of the Greek name of the god of the wandering star planet, more often called Hermeion, which we call Hermes when we bring the Greek directly into English, or when we're just directly talking about the planet, we say Mercury. Its name comes from the Greek verb glitter or gleam. It literally means the shining one. If you're into fairy magic, have you heard of a shining one? The shining one has all kinds of illusions. There's also wordplay with still and bone, or steel and bone. The steel part of stillbone makes us think of the Latin stylus, which can be a stake, it can be like a staff, and of course it's also a stylus. It's where we get that English word. It's a pointed implement used for writing. Sometimes one uses the pointed end for incising letters onto a wax tablet, and then there's a long flat side where you erase it if you're writing on a wax tablet. So throughout the monad, the reader is going to encounter multiple places where something bright, sharp, and pointy will pierce something. Mercury pierces itself. You get the point of Aries, you get the monad itself being pierced, and then it seems to pierce the ethers and then emit or create a punctum, a point, a portion, or a puncture, depending on how you're taking later wordplay. On to bone. We had steel, now we're going to bone. If you're a French speaker, you know bon, c'est bon, it's good in French. That French word comes from Latin, bonum. So if you combine the connotations of steel with bonum, you get something real interesting. Bonum in Latin can mean also the moral or metaphysical goods. And in Latin translations of Plato, it's the good, the bonitatis. That the civic good that all of us should share, that the philosopher king should ensure. So if we're playing with words a la John Dee, what you're getting is the piercing first creation of the good into the universe as a monad. Okay, there. So yes, put that in your pipe and smoke it. I'm going to repeat it again because it's important. The piercing first creation of the good into the universe as a monad. Now, like I said, I'm not going to do this every time he goes on to a wordplay. In the class part of this, I'm only going to do it a few more times. I'll put the rest of it in a playlist. Also about this Hermetic frontispiece, there's one of the most reputable Dee scholars, you can find a link to his article below, wrote a whole article about this frontispiece as a Hermetic frontispiece. Now, he did that a few years after Nancy and I had said that in an article in the Journal of the Western Mystery Tradition. Thank you, Jeffrey Cooperman, for publishing it. So all I can conclude, I guess, if I want to be in a charitable mood is, you know, if you study Dee, minds think alike. Moving on. The Emerald Tablet of Hermes Trismegistus is something that you probably know. If you don't and you're studying Dee, you should, because he will paraphrase it often. He calls his monad symbol his Hermetic seal, coming from Hermes. And the part of it, if you know it, that you're probably most familiar with is as above, so below. By the time we get all the way through Theorem 20, we'll add something to this, as within, so without. And just as a side note to those of you who are interested in Dee and Kelly's Enochian work, that addition will be really important if you start to look at the Great Table of Earth. No, that's not the real tablet. No one knows where the real tablet is. That's a cool public domain graphic I grabbed. Let me give you Isaac Newton's translation of a very common Latin version of the Emerald Tablet. Why am I using Isaac Newton? Because we think of him as this brilliant physicist, and he was, but he wrote far more on alchemy than he ever wrote on what we would now call physics. He translates this Nuremberg manuscript. Here's where you can find it at the University of Indiana, and I'm just going to read it. "'Tis true without lying, certain and most true. That which is below is like that which is above, and that which is above is like that which is below, to do the miracle of the only one thing, monad. And as all things have been and arose from one, monad, by the mediation of one, another monad." We'll explain that later. So all things have their birth from this one thing by adaptation. The sun is its father, the moon is its mother, the wind hath carried it in its belly, the earth is its nurse, the father of all perfection in the world is here. Its force or power is entire if it be converted into earth. Separate thou the earth from the fire, the subtle from the gross, sweetly with great industry. It ascends from the earth to the heaven, and again it descends to the earth, and receives the force of things superior and inferior. By this means You shall have the glory of the whole world, and thereby all obscurity shall fly from you. Its force is above all force, for it vanquishes every subtle thing and penetrates every solid thing. So the world was created. From this are and do come admirable adaptations, whereof the means is here in this. Hence I am called Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice great Hermes, having the three parts of the philosophy of the whole world. That which I have said of the operation of the sun is accomplished and ended. The operation of the sun is a frequent way people referred to the alchemical great work in the Renaissance. The operation of the sun is the philosopher's stone. All right, let me stop sharing my screen for a minute so that you know I really exist. Hi, as I said, I'm not going to zoom in on one word as much as I did on mercury. What I'm going to do in the second half of this is just tell you what the contents, other contexts are, and leave it to you to study them. I will look at particular parts of them when a theorem or when the letter calls for it, but I'm not going to explicate all of them because a lot of you know them, right? You probably know more about them than you realize, and if not, it'd be really fun to learn. Okay, here's the first one, Genesis. It's the most obvious one. Now, one thing you want to know is he's not using the King James Bible. That's after Dee wrote this. He's going to be trying to use Greek New Testament and Genesis in the Hebrew Bible, especially Genesis 1:1. That's the let there be light, or fiat lux, which in his time was written LVX, remember. Today we'd say fiat lux, let there be light. And the opening of the Hebrew Bible. Now this is, I just wanted a graphic here. So this is kind of a cool graphic that someone took of the first chapter of the Bereshit, or Genesis, in the Hebrew Bible. It's written on an egg. Oh, cosmogenesis. Today, Hebrew and Greek are sacred languages. We will also be talking about what a sacred language is. It's one of my absolute favorite topics. But just take Hebrew. If you've studied the Kabbalah, the language itself gives form to things. Talk about that in the very next slide. But also say the numbers and letters are, you write a letter for a number, the number refers to a particular shape. There are all kinds of things that you can do with the Hebrew alphabet, and also in ancient Greek, that you cannot do with the English alphabet. Dee is trying to treat Latin as a sacred language. He lives in a dangerous time where it's easy to get yourself killed. It would be really nice for the church fathers to think Latin is another sacred language, the Latin Vulgate that the Bible is in. There are some problems with this, but that's what he's doing. And we're going to look at this, particularly with LVX as a key word. He's going to do Euclidean translations of it and so forth. So Genesis is the first big context. The Sepher Yetzera is the second, the book of creation formation. Here's the frontispiece of one that was printed in Mantua, Italy. And Dee collected Hebrew grammars, but since he was interested in Kabbalah, we might say that Dee had a text like this. It is perhaps the oldest rabbinical treatise of Kabbalistic philosophy. Okay, if you are out there and you're a scholar of rabbinical Kabbalah, yes, I know there's a whole debate about whether this is really Kabbalistic or whether it gives birth to the Kabbalah. I'm just trying to keep things simple here. So it is certainly something you study in conjunction with the Kabbalah. And here we're talking about Christian or Hermetic Kabbalah, not Rabbinic Kabbalah. It describes the cosmos as created by an alphabet, the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. And then from 10 ideal numbers, not arithmetic numbers, you might think of them more as powers that are emanations of the Ein Sof. Before that is, well, we'll talk about it later. But the Ein Sof, you might think of as infinity, or literally, it means without end. Taken together, these These comprise the 32 paths of wisdom that are often pictured on the tree of life. Here is a depiction of the tree of life. I can't emphasize enough that this is not the only one. In rabbinic Kabbalah, one of the things you do is you picture the tree of life in all kinds of different ways. Picturing the Kabbalah is a really cool thing. Now, since I'm not a rabbi, and in Dee's time, I would never have been allowed to study this stuff anyway, since I'm female, I'm not going to tell you a lot about rabbinic Kabbalah. I'm talking about Hermetic Kabbalah, and this is what is called the Kircher tree. It is by far the most commonly used in Christian or Hermetic Kabbalah since the time of John Dee. The reference here, Kircher, is to Athanasius Kircher, because he refers to Dee and Dee's use of Kabbalah in his work. Since Dee's only Kabbalistic treatise was lost, we'll never know explicitly that Dee used this. Like Dee never says, here's how I draw out the tree of life. But if you use this tree in understanding the creation in, for example, the first 10 theorems of the monad, it works. There is no reason to think he used any other tree than that. And it's also used by the Rosicrucians, influenced by Dee. If Dee influenced Victorian magical orders, like the original order of the Golden Dawn and the AA, they tend to use these. This is the name, by the way, of Dee's lost work on the Kabbalah. He makes a compendious table of Hebrew Kabbalah. It translates literally like what you'd think it would be going by cognates. Okay, his third big cosmogenic text, and the one that you may be the least familiar with, is Plato's Timaeus. That is why down below I have given you a link to two good sources, one textual and one another YouTube video explaining the cosmogenic part of Plato's Timaeus. This is a common picture by Raphael of Plato, but you can see he's holding the Timaeus. Okay, this is a geometric story of creation. It's just wow. It's that, after this great monath, this is punctured and things start to be created. The first thing are geometric shapes. Like the first two cosmogenic stories, you could spend years studying it. So we're just going to get an outline here, and that's why I've given you references to more below. Graduate students out there, hey, you got like 50 papers just doing this. They have whole conferences on Plato's Timaeus. The universe is made by the divine craftsman. That's the synonym for, guess what we would call God, or the center of the universe, or whatever causes the Big Bang. Everything, including elements and geometric shapes, are alive, and they're part of the one, the monad, which is a copy of a divine one. So, and then you have a third being, think Hermes Trismegistus. So there's a divine one, and the divine one creates the monad, but there's also a receptacle in there. And for more explanation, listen to a Greek scholar below. The creator creates the four elements. The creator creates a circular globe that rotates. The creator creates the soul of the world. The world is alive and everything in it is alive. Now, Neoplatonians often try to merge this with Genesis. And then both with the Sepher Yetzera, or they merge Genesis and the Sepher Yetzera and then try to merge it with the Timaeus. This causes certain problems, which we could talk about another time, but they generally ignore them. So for the purposes of these 24 videos, unless it's an egregious clash, I'm going to ignore them. And if you're interested, yes, this is a dialogue that mentions Atlantis. Okay, there are correspondences with Platonic solids. You probably know some of them. Let's say the hexahedron or the cube gets associated with Earth. The most sacred is the dodecahedron. It's associated with ether. We'll talk about all of these in their time. This is a great time to mention my sponsor, by the way, because if you want to learn more about Platonic solids, geometric models, see the link below, has some great guides to help you, like this poster. And so you can go through and see what a tetrahedron looks like from different perspectives and so on. And they have a lot of other great posters. And here you can see a few of them. Thanks again, Geometric Models. Appreciate your support. All right. Now we're to the third part of this. That's why you just had a blank screen to remind me that we're going into the third part. How does Dee explain the context? That's really important. So here is his introduction to the theorems. The Hieroglyphic Monad of John Dee of London. He says he is explaining it mathematically, magically, Kabbalistically, and anagogically. He doesn't say alchemically, remember. So those are his contexts. Now, of these, we might jump ahead to magic and realize, not in the work of all alchemists, but in the work of John Dee, magic and alchemy are essentially the same thing. He is not interested in the kind of alchemy that is telling you how to smelt lead or something like that. He's interested, by all evidence in his work, in philosophic alchemy, or the alchemy perhaps of time and bloodlines. But so he makes these two the same thing. Okay. He will use the Sephiroth and the Tree of Life and other types of Kabbalah, and he tells you he's doing that. Kabbalah has many spellings. You probably know that, but I guess I should explain that just in case anyone doesn't. Anagogical, I said I would define later. This is that time. It can mean pertaining to a mystical interpretation of scripture. That is, when you get to anagogical, we're not caring about the literal Bible. We're not even caring about a metaphorical Bible. We're looking at the highest mystical level. And this is something they did in the late Middle Ages. Now, they still believed in the other interpretations, which you don't necessarily need to do, but you're welcome to if you want to look at his anagogical interpretation, because it's doing this that he's gonna stumble onto the geometry of higher dimensions. Medieval Christian exegesis of the Latin Vulgate Bible reinterpreted many episodes of Hebrew scripture according to four levels: literal, allegorical, moral, and anagogical. The anagogical is the highest. So now that we've got to the end, we're going to go back to the beginning, mathematical. So for now, I'm just going to underscore again, like in the first video, the math of Dee's time is not the math of today. It's not the math you studied in high school, elementary school, college, anywhere else. There was no such thing as algebra. There was no such thing as calculus. Geometry did not use numbers. Arithmetic and geometry both had spiritual overtones. That's why you could get in such trouble as a magician if you were a mathematician. And geometry was a Neoplatonic art. Geometry was also part of the medieval trivium and quadrivium. That's a whole story. Okay, so John Dee corresponded with the greatest mathematicians of his time. If they weren't a good mathematician, Dee would have nothing to do with them. I mean, Dee was well respected as a mathematician. The closest that we would see in the England of Dee's time to modern math comes from one of his students, Thomas Digges, who he was also a guardian for. Oops, sorry, Thomas Digges, I didn't put an E in your name there. Oops. But Digges, for instance, he's the one who starts to use numbers with geometry and optics, because Dee is going to do things with conic sections, and that's connected to optics. And Digges will have equations. Terry, what did you do here? Would be. Delete that not. It's with Digges you get things that look like trigonometry. So we'll look more about what Dee says with number and magnitude in his introduction to the first English translation of Euclid when we start talking about the theorems. It's online there, but you'll see that link from me a bunch more times. There's the frontispiece to Dee's with the first English translation of Euclid, with a preface by Dee, and the translation is by Billingsley. But let's jump forward to 1847, okay? Here's a geometric text. Do you remember when you took geometry? You sometime in school studied, like, this is a square that has, four sides and all of that. But if you got into where you're doing proofs, you were using numbers. And then some of those turned into things like trigonometry. All right, this is an 1847 text by Oliver Byrne, the first 6 books of the Elements of Euclid. There they use color diagrams and symbols. So if you have trouble reading this, like let 3 orange circles be as to a black square, Yeah, we would have trouble reading this, right? That's how people study geometry. It didn't use numbers. All right. Well, I would love to talk longer. I have a bad habit of doing that. I'm going to stop now. That's enough for today. Thank you so much for joining me. Our next video will be out in about a week, and that's where I'm going to jump into the letter to Maximilian that begins the hieroglyphic monad. Okay, I hope to see you then. And by the way, if you want to look down in the playlist section, there is another one starting up that is wordplay. So I will keep my digressions and entertainment about wordplay into that section. Have a great day. Bye-bye.